Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Are we on? Yeah? It's on already. Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome this morning to AIT. The weather is not so good. We hope to have numbers, but we need to get started because we have a very, very full schedule, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy and appreciate if we can run it to time. Very quickly, householding, just make sure you know where the emergency exits are. There's 2 up there at the back, and there's 2 here at the front. I feel like the air hostess, 2 here and 2 at the back. But safety is all important to us at every time. The conference theme is our evolving learning landscape. And just to put it in context of the world that we live in, before I have the conference officially opened, some of you might recognize this. It's a Motorola phone. We nicknamed it the Brick. It's kind of delicate up here, but can you imagine carrying that around and all you can do with it is make a phone call? This is my mobile phone. Virtually a computer in my hand, and we know they come a lot smaller than that. Has the landscape evolved? Our life's landscape has evolved. Today we're looking at our evolving educational landscape. We are here in AIT, and Dr. Neil CESI is going to open our conference for us. A man who is very, very interested and committed to the whole area of education design and research, pedagogy, and also very committed to an organization called TARG, which I'm sure he may mention himself. So without further ado, I'd like to invite, I think I said Neil, but it should be Niall, shouldn't it? Yeah, Dr. Niall CESI to open our conference. Thank you.
Chair, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, delegates and colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 47th annual conference for the Computers in Education Society. And as the Chair has mentioned, I think that there is much credit to go to the organising committee for this conference, but in particular the theme of the conference this year, our evolving learning landscape. I'm not sure in the history of education have we seen the amount of change that we have seen in the last number of years and going to see in the next number of years. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here to Athlone Institute of Technology. I'm deputising on behalf of the President, who unfortunately couldn't make it this morning. He's out of the country. But again, he sends his regards and his welcome to all of the delegates here today. For those of you who don't know Athlone Institute of Technology, we pride ourselves on being a contemporary third-level institution distinguished by academic excellence in teaching, learning and research. Athlone Institute of Technology this year was awarded the Sunday Times Institute of Technology of the Year. We previously won it in 2018, and we were runners-up in 2017, an achievement that we are very, very proud of here. We are also we top Ireland's official league tables for research in the sector, and quite recently we started benchmarking internationally. And in the international benchmark of U Multi-Rank, we are in the top 25 universities in the world in interdisciplinary research in both 2018 and 2019. But more importantly for us as an institute of technology and an educational leader in the Midlands, we've been ranked #1 nationally for student satisfaction consistently now for the past 6 years. And that's something that we really pride ourselves on. Your conference today looks quite exciting. I'm really excited about the evolving practices in education that are being driven by this society. And when I was looking through the conference proceedings, I was looking at areas like robotics to enhance creativity in STEAM classrooms, digital badging for post-primary education, and a connected and flipped classroom. All agendas that are topical not only at primary, post-primary, but also in higher education. And I've no doubt that today's schedule will stimulate and drive a lot of future innovation in terms of education and computing in education. Technology has been gradually transforming the education landscape over the past decade in particular. And I think the onset and the introduction of computer science as a Leaving Cert subject establishes the importance of this capability in this area of study in general education, and is to be welcomed. And I'd say much credit goes to this organisation for driving that agenda. In March of last year, Minister McHugh announced a further €50 million investment in ICT infrastructure for all primary and post-primary schools under the Project Ireland 2040 initiative, which takes the total spend for the digital strategy for schools' ITC infrastructure fund now to €110 million. What was interesting at the launch, Minister McHugh noted that we are living in a time which has been fundamentally transformed by digital technologies, disruptive technologies in cloud, and mobile and social technologies that are now revolutionizing not only the way that we work, but also the very fundamental way that we live. Critical creative thinking, problem-solving skills, and adaptability will be key to ensuring that our young people flourish in this environment, and we need to make sure that they are well prepared. Indeed, within AIT, our own strategic plan 2019 to 2023 has positioned us in a very much a transitional mode as we work towards technological university status. And we have committed very much to the digital innovations, ensuring that our infrastructure offers students and staff more access capabilities and flexibilities to allow us to deliver a better student experience. We too are investing in a campus master plan, ensuring that we are future-proofing the needs of students for tomorrow through planned initiatives such as bring your own device, virtual labs, and in actual fact, we are expanding to a virtual campus. All of which will ensure that our campus is modern, efficient, and stimulating learning and working within this environment so that we can sustain the excellence of our academic staff and our support staff with a view to meeting the needs of future learning and future students. The chair mentioned my background is a technology teacher, and I'm still heavily involved in educational research in the area of design and technology education. And one of the primary objectives is that we serve our young people. And I think one of the challenges is that today's children are preparing for work that we as adults haven't fully conceived. I'm not sure we fully comprehend what the workforce will look like in the future. And the new roles being created by many industries really challenge the job prospects and the position of capability for our sons and daughters and our future students. There is an estimate that the jobs of the future do not yet fully exist. And there's certainly recognition that 10 years ago, many of the jobs that currently exist were either in their infancy or not yet conceived. We can't predict industry and the job market, but what we can do as educators is we can work towards making that transition easier for future professionals by relying on the improvement of the learning environment, the methods, tools, and challenges that we can address within the education space. One aspect of that, and I can see that it's also addressed in your program, that we need to have a serious discussion around is the recognition and the appropriate accreditations of new learnings, particularly the rise in micro-credentials and digital badging, which is spoken about in your conference proceedings. And this allows our students to achieve their goals whenever, wherever, and however they choose. They allow students to feel in control of their learning, and it allows students to build bespoke suites of personally relevant qualifications to meet industry needs, but also to be relevant to future employers. They allow learners to advance their skills and knowledge and will revolutionize the way we think about upskilling and continuous education for all. Specifically, I want to emphasize their commitment here to pedagogical innovation and encourage you to stay challenging the assumptions and conceiving new methodologies for the benefit of our young learners. I'm proud to say that we too are at the forefront of research within this pedagogical space, And only a matter of weeks ago, we launched Project Talent, which is an Erasmus Plus EU-funded project that combines academics from higher education with post-primary teachers across Ireland, the UK, Spain and the Netherlands. And the focus of that is to adopt team-based learning as a way of developing critical, collaborative decision-making and problem-solving. The project, led at AIT by Nuala Harding, our Head of Teaching and Learning, is providing educators with resources essential to developing students' critical skills and collaborative capabilities. And 4 of our Athlone-based feeder schools, Athlone Community College, Coláiste Ciarán, Our Lady's Bower and Marsh Secondary School, will all avail of the innovative upskilling with the facilitation that this education will bring to the teachers in their respective school communities. In addition, AIT hosts the Technology Education Research Group, acronym TERG, which was mentioned in the Chair's address this morning. This group is internationally active in research areas such as enacted practice, spatial cognition, spatial skills, embedded cognition, and a holistic assessment strategies, all areas that are transversal and important for the new generation of capabilities that we will be forced to try and assess, recognise, and progress. Recently, the TERG group have linked with Timex under the leadership of Dr. Niall Murray to establish a research agenda looking at educational and pedagogical benefits of augmented and virtual reality as they apply to the context of learning gain. This is an exciting venture that we hope will have significant impact on future teaching and learning. So, as we lead the agenda together, I'm reminded of the words of Brian Herbert, who once said, "The capacity to learn is a gift, the ability to learn is a skill, and the willingness to learn is a choice." Today, the willingness from this community is apparent, and I commend your endeavours to improve education for our learners and improve education in Ireland for generations to come. I would like to close out now and wish you a wonderful day and remind you that our doors as a higher education institute, both to your schools, your students, and yourselves as educators, is always open. Gormila Mahagod.
I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Niall for giving his time and a wonderful overview of AIT as it stands at the moment. And I think we're all, what should I say, noted that he was very much concerned, and AIT is very much concerned about the pedagogy, the skills. 50 million for hardware or 100 million or whatever the figure is grand, but it really has no meaning unless it's contextualised within the pedagogy and what happens within our classrooms, and that teachers are the critical part of that. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Niall Seary. Without further ado then, I'm going to move ahead to our keynote speaker. Cornelia is known to many of you. She is working in NUIG, very much involved in pre-service teaching, very much involved and committed to the T in STEM, I think is the way she describes herself on a number of occasions. So again, it's not for me to take over her time, so without, again, further ado, I'll introduce Cornelia to you. Thank you.
Okay, gur mil mahagat Adriana Suktan Kuru or Duspora Agus on Falcha. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I suppose, you know, as keynote, one's always daunted, oh my gosh, what am I going to speak about? But yeah, the theme today, our evolving learning landscape, really gives one great scope. We see that as evidenced in the agenda, as Adrienne and as Niall has mentioned, there's such diversity that come to the CESI Con, and we see coding in primary schools, the introduction of computer science at post-primary, policy adoption, and a variety of initiatives being presented today. So we certainly have that evolving learning landscape evidenced today. A number of years ago, many moons ago, I guess, I worked in IT and management consulting, and I remember in training in Chicago, we were kind of introduced, to business and systems design and development. And one of the key components at the start is to think in business analysis, you look at the as is before you predict the to be. So I'm going to take that kind of approach today and look at the as is and kind of the historic or perspective on CESI. And just to remember that CESI stands for Computers in Education Society of Ireland. So the remit and scope of CESI is quite large. And when we think about it, I think, it was born in 1973, that, as was mentioned earlier, so it's 47 years old. And if we put that in context, that CESI originated at an era of significant change in Irish education. If we think in 1966, free second level education was introduced by Donogh O'Malley and the Lemass government. In 1965, there was a groundbreaking report on the investment in education. And it was only at that point that Irish governments connected education and economic development of the country and of the citizens. And really, that report was informed by the concept of education as a means by which we invested in the next generation. And so in 1973, when CESI was born, the main aims at that point was around training facilities for teachers and the introduction of computer studies as a post-primary individual subject. So if we look at today and the Irish, the continuum, the Irish curriculum, we see how computing and technology is embedded from Ashtere in primary, junior cycle, and senior cycle. And I inserted the key competencies of the draft primary curriculum that was introduced just this week by the NCCA. And we see that one of the key competencies is being a digital learner. So at primary education, our curriculum is ensuring that each student attending primary school is going to be a digital learner. And that interconnection and that flow through to second level is and should be evident and will be. The second aim of CESI was in the introduction of computer studies as a post-primary subject. And so we know and we have computer science as an individual subject now. And those 40 teachers, the pioneering teachers, and some of which are here today, are really championing that. So in terms of the evolving learning landscape, the two aims of CESI in its origins, have they been fulfilled or are they being fulfilled? And maybe that conversation is ongoing. I think the aims, the subject has been introduced, training facilities are improving, but there's still an ongoing conversation, and those aims are still, I think, very much alive. But there's also additional challenges deserving of our attention. And we know that there's a strong correlation between education and digital education and knowledge and skills. And so that conversation, I think, we need to ignite. And I'm going to introduce, I guess, some topics around that today. There's also a connect between policy, pedagogy, and technology. And again, to put it into context, some international and national contexts that kind of position this space and our conversations. And looking at some of the international policies, we've the OECD first in terms of innovating education and education for innovation in 2016. And it really was about the impact of digital technologies on teaching and learning. The DEAP then is an EU policy which introduces 11 different factors about digital competencies. Education and Training 2020 framework is concerned with the lifelong learning trajectory and the connect between formal and informal learning. And then we have our own national policies in this space, the digital strategy, our education action plans, the STEM strategy as well, and not forgetting our digital learning framework that really positions and provides a structure for teachers and students on that journey. So these are some of the policies, I think, that dictate and govern the trajectory and roadmap that we are on. Some topics and discuss that today. So I'm going to look at, or just touch on, diversity in computing, data and AI, partnerships and collaborations, and then conclude talking about some limits of technology. So firstly, in terms of diversity of computing, so the inclusion and exclusion of computing and technology. Diversity is a fact of nature and of society, but it's a fact and it's a concept that's sometimes ignored by computing and the computing industry. And computing and automation works great for typical cases, but diversity guarantees that non-normality. And are we and are our students always concerned with that? Whether it's deterministic algorithms or data-driven probabilistic reasoning, software struggles with diversity. And those individuals who are well-resourced, who have strong educational backgrounds, are likely to benefit most from computing and digital education. And as Adrienne mentioned, and even Niall earlier too, to date, policy fix is generally around providing access to hardware and to devices at homes and at schools. But this can also be problematic, and it can be problematic on two fronts. Firstly, it encourages the focus on those individuals who are isolated. It reinforces the problem status in society and the inequalities in social structures. These responses view technology as a good thing, as the solution. Again, ignoring the socioeconomic societal challenges and the aspects of technology, the strong neoliberal ideology that drives much of what is developed for education. So solutions that offer access and skills are likely to remain an easy fix for policymakers. So instead, as educators, should we spearhead a change of approach? Access doesn't guarantee participation, and that's evidenced in even the uptake of computer science as a subject in the UK, for example. Researchers and educators need to better theorize the links between education, developments in technology, and inequality. And we also have to strive to actively, design technologies that facilitate a more equitable future for everyone. I think it's also important to highlight generally the discourse around diversity in computing really is often around gender in computing, but diversity in computing has many other facets and elements that we need to be considerate of. So this is not a mirror, first and foremost, but the learning intention was to reflect on our evolving learning landscape. So how do you, in your class, in your school or situation, how do you accommodate diversity or consider it? This is going to be interactive. Hey, my second point is around data and AI and the implications for education. So machines, technology, computers, it gathers our data from our shopping to our political affiliations, and AI is hungry for data. And we're all aware that data can be biased, it's about the past, it also is what makes computing powerful and valuable, but also harmful. And also, AI will increasingly become an engine for education and student data the fuel. So as educators, we need to pay close attention to the platform providers and to the ecosystem that we're reliant on, that's using our student data and that we work within. So questions in this regard, like will education platforms act as large data brokers to advanced AI backends? Will the data providers be bought up? Will it lead to classrooms on platforms or platforms in classrooms? We also need to consider the effect of datafication and fundamentally on the gathering of data and how that's influencing our learning, which leads into the whole idea of machine learning. The implications of increasing datafication of education raises significant questions about the models of behaviour that we learn as humans from machines and how that's affecting our classroom. I guess we need to question how much of this salient machine learning is having on our education system and how much of that is undertaken by the humans. So some questions. Where is the most significant influential learning happening in society now? What kinds of systems are undertaking the learning? And how is our learning as humans, as citizens, as educators, and the learning of our students, how is that intermingled in the ways that machines learn? These questions extend the idea of formal education. And it also kind of highlights the extent to which we need to be cognizant and expand our horizons somewhat. Supoff writes about the division of labour and the division of learning, and really questions, I suppose, the distribution of knowledge and whether one is included or excluded in learning and the opportunity to learn. Questions also about which people, institutions, processes, and have the authority to determine what is included in learning, that they're able to learn, and also that they're able to act on their knowledge. So again, as educators, we perhaps need to work to re-establish the value of formal education in an era of ubiquitous learning by machines using our data. We perhaps need to challenge the accepted view of what constitutes meaningful and worthwhile knowledge for our students and for future society. My third topic of reflection is around partnerships and collaborations, and I guess questioning who's driving the agenda. There's a commercial ecosystem in education and very much evident in educational technology specifically. But again, we need to pay close attention to the educational platforms and providers and what's occurring in our ecosystem and in the infrastructure. The global digital education agenda will continue to influence and be influenced by large corporations, philanthropic interests, publishers, etc. And alongside that, we have growing markets in China and India. And how do all these corporate actors influence the learning that's taking place in our classes, in our schools, in our environment? There's nothing wrong or new with these contributions and with commercial contributions, but I think we do need to ask questions about regulation and oversight activities within our education setting. Some software development companies value efficiency, value convenience, neutrality, competition, but equally so within education, we have to also be conscious of humanity, sustainability, equality. So should large corporations continue to exercise soft power in influencing and shaping education decision-making, while at the same time profiting from decisions being made? How might we better ensure that commercial actors support public education rather than working to create demand for their products? How might educators be supported in maintaining their role in guiding and leading development of digital education to our youngest and most vulnerable in society? Are there counter-narratives that could be developed against the behaviours which are promoted in the development of data-driven personalised learning systems, for example? How do companies support or influence your classroom or your school, directly or indirectly? My fourth topic of reflection is concerned with the limits of technology. Computing, as we're all aware, is very powerful, but we also have to remember that it can't solve every problem, that it's often wrong, that it's not neutral, and it's certainly not free. When we think about it, computing is premised on industrial society's default worldview of ongoing economic growth that's both desirable and achievable. But this growth-focused worldview is at odds with other scientific communities in terms of ecological and social reasons and challenges that we contribute to, and that we have to find solutions for. So, computing underlies virtually all of the infrastructure in global society, and therefore it's critical in actually finding the solution, and that we adapt to the global limits. There's a movement by Nardi in terms of computing within limits, where we're really conscious about working in a constrained environment, that we're conscious of climate, that we're conscious of social issues, and that we kind of, I suppose, teach that within our computing environments. Because teaching programming doesn't always teach this. In fact, sometimes learning to code, we adapt the attitude that technology can solve everything, that computing is only technical, that it's not social, that we're concerned with algorithms and not data. So, and that we're concerned, with error handling and not social justice. So incorporating all of these values, I think we have to really concern ourselves with computing within limits. So how do we, in computing education, study and teach all of these things in a way that transfers to everyday decisions in life and in work? So I've talked about diversity in computing, data and AI, partnerships, collaborations, and also some of the limits. And it's fine highlighting some of the challenges that we have, but what are the solutions, or what can we as educators do to address this? So I think we need to actively design technologies that facilitate and that we're conscious of an equitable future for everyone. That we work to re-establish the value of formal education in an era of ubiquitous learning by machines using our data. That we're supported, that we as educators are supported in maintaining our role in guiding and in leading the global education agenda. And that we also explore other forms of computing within limits that consider the global ecological and material limits that we're all facing. Also, in terms of steps forward, when we think of computing is driving automation, are we promising technological answers to some of the challenges? Are we amplifying disinformation on social media? Is our field, are we ignoring some of the big problems that we actually are uniquely positioned to answer and to come up with solutions for? And how do the values of CESI and the computing education community in Ireland and digital education community, how do we reinforce, amplify, or contribute to the solutions? So maybe when we're implementing education or education devices or software within schools, maybe we need to think about our core values and the assumptions we're making about the learning and the learners. And so how do we embody these core values and how do we embed them? What are the assumptions about pedagogy? And what are the models of pedagogy that we aim to promote? How do the technologies contribute to the education of the child in our classroom that enables them to be a productive citizen, leaving our education system to engage in a democratic and civilized society? Aligned with that, society needs to rapidly recognize that if and when new technologies are causing harm, that we actually stop the innovation in its tracks. But in order to do that, we have to question, we have to research, and really critically reflect on the technology and the implications at the same pace as the technology is emerging. And that's difficult for educators. But it's something we have to kind of get up to speed, and it's a challenge that we have to engage with. Neil Selwyn talks about that we need care rather than competition, cooperation rather than rivalry, and imagination rather than corporized creativity. And the computing education community are in a position to change a lot. We can discover new ways to teach, and we can encourage the role and promote the role of computing and ensure that everybody is competent in digital education going forward. So thinking back, my aim and my learning intention was to reflect on our evolving learning landscape through a critical but positive lens. And I hope I posed some questions and I started, or that you can start a conversation today around some of the societal implications of computing education, the strengths, but also the areas of improvement that we can incorporate in our practice. We need to stay curious, we need to research, we need to be active in problem posing as well as problem solving. And today I think we have that opportunity to really reflect, to have conversations and to question. Gur míle maith agaibh.
Wow, I think any of those questions could keep us occupied for quite a period of time. Cornelia, are you happy to take a few questions? We have time for about 3 questions, I'd say, if anybody wants to lead off the floor. Everybody being very shy. I have to say that I myself feel quite challenged, having been a long time in education and kind of at the very early stages of technology, that technology has gone at that rate. My classroom, my teaching has sought to adopt, but perhaps not as critically as you have said that we should do, and that the whole idea of technology being within society and of society, and that it doesn't handle diversity very well, and all of us know that that's what we are supposed to be doing. And it strikes me, and I just wonder that as teachers, we don't really get an opportunity at times to say, what is it we do? What are the values of it? Is there a forum that we can be a body that says we're part of the discussion, not as an individual teacher, but as educators, that we have a unique thing? Because sometimes you feel you're being a bit pushed out, that there's the book on this, oh sure, we can just go and look that up. But teachers do a lot more that's kind of intangible in some ways. Have you any ideas how we can actually be part of that discussion, not as individual teachers, but as at that table with industry?
But I think that's why the CESI community and subject associations, I think, are really important, isn't it? And it's the community voice. But it is engagement.
Sorry, can you use the microphone?
Sorry.
There's a handheld on the table there.
Handheld on the table. Oh,
Here.
Right in front of you. There you go.
Okay. Okay.
Wireless mic there.
Thanks.
thanks, Corn.
Oh, yeah. Now I feel as if I'm singing. Okay. Yeah, but I think in answering your question, Adrienne, it's about being involved in communities like CESI, subject associations, but it's all about the conversation, isn't it? It's the ecosystem. We're reliant on industry, and that it's very good and it's complementary. We're also our teachers are also, teaching a curriculum and teaching exams, and we've all those things to consider. But it's considering everything, and it's keeping the conversation ongoing and in practice. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's.
But I think. Oh, sorry.
I always think it's kind of difficult. Teachers are so busy down at the board face or whatever you like to call it, working on the stuff, that I've had the opportunity of, I've kind of retired from the classroom. I've had the opportunity to attend meetings with the department and with various agencies, and what strikes me most is that the teachers are not always present at the conversations that actually most impact on what they do in the class, because they're busy doing what they should be doing, because that's 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And here are all of you here on a Saturday and people with us on a Friday. And I just wonder, is there an opportunity for a teacher voice that's still very much practitioner-led to be in those conversations. I know people get seconded and they can join things, but they're small in numbers really relative to the population of teachers.
Yeah, but even like teachers in practice conducting research in their classes, kind of like, again, the pace at which technology is evolving, we as teachers and practitioners need to be researching at the same pace, if that's possible, to see what's harmful or what's advantageous to our classes and to our students. Yeah, there's a lot to contend with and a lot of balls in the air at the same time, but kind of engaging and keeping the conversation and keeping abreast of technology and developments and policy is very important.
Would anybody like to come in here?
Yeah, can I just say, so one thing I feel is missing.
Sorry, it's just we're streaming, so
Sorry. Okay. No, one thing I feel that's missing is often models. We're missing models in education. And if I look at something like system life cycle models, or if I look at product life cycle models, or if I look at instructional design life cycle models, I see sort of analysis, design, development, implementation, development, and sometimes I think we don't give enough time to some of these using similar models. So the first stage being analysis. So what are we doing? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Where do we want to get to? And I suppose the mention of the different things that come to mind after the presentation. One is the idea of technology maybe not being there for diversity, but I kind of very much disagree with that. I think that technology can be used more effectively for diversity than anything else. For people in different third world countries, people from poorer communities, but also for people outside of the classroom. So the technology is there. But for me, one of the important things that I find that we use in business, that we use well, maybe in business, but we don't seem to use so much in education, and that can also be used on an individual level, is analyzing what we're doing. What are the problems? What do we want to do better? The planning around that, and on the school level, or on a state level, then the budget around that as well, because that has also been considered. So I would love to see a lot more of models being introduced into education, and those type of models.
Yeah, I suppose, like, you know, at the end of the day, education doesn't move as quickly as industry, doesn't it not? And they're two different systems. So you're trying, and particularly within digital education or computer science education, you're contending with a lot of different variables that are working at different paces. We can only do our best. I think we have to be conscious of an awful lot. I agree with your point around diversity and technology. I think sometimes some of my questions are actually probing, or have we thought of all of these things, or that's what I want to do. It does increase, it opens up opportunities for a lot of people, but sometimes too it highlights issues and problems that we didn't consider always too. So there's numerous instances of that, and I suppose that's what the research, and that's what we have to research more as well. The challenges in that space. But equally so, it's very interesting too, is there's an inequality issue in terms of if a company is beside my school's going to get funded, whereas if I'm in Ballygo Backwards, do I get that same funding, or does my child get that same support? So there's loads of issues, and that's why, I don't know, it's an area of discussion, but should there be regulation? Should there be equality for all schools in public education fundamentally for support in that regard? It's a question.
We've been busy with our data protection, our GDPR policy at the moment. And you were talking about, a lot of the schools now, we're employing companies to manage student data. And, we've had a lot of discussion in the school about what we should put up online, because you're creating a digital footprint for that child. Mm-hmm. And I suppose, how do we manage that ownership of the data once it goes up on a third-party system is kind of...
Yeah, and then what happens when that third party gets bought over, for example? So there's a lot that, are we conscious of, and do we understand the implications? It's... How much confidentiality do you put up there? Yeah. And if it's if the company is bought over, if it's sent on, exactly, there's lots of implications or questions that we kind of have to be conscious of. I think that we as a subject teacher or a principal or school leader, that's not my expertise perhaps, too. So,
At this point in time, in order to keep us on schedule, I think I'd ask you to put your hands together and say many, many thanks to Cornelia. I suspect that those questions will be rocking around the CESI mailing list for a little bit of time, and perhaps we could look at them in more detail and maybe a slightly different forum going forward over the next year or so, because I think all of them are extremely pertinent. Now, a few housekeeping details, please. If you would just have a quick look at your schedule, your programme for today. For those of you who are not familiar, all the IT rooms are to the left as you go out of the Douglas Hyde. The other B rooms are you go back to the entrance where you came in and turn right, and then it's down a corridor. Am I right in that, Katie? One or two things, there are changes to our programme, just bear with me for a moment. If you look at the 12 o'clock session with Tony Riley, due to unforeseen circumstances, Tony is unable to be with us, so that has had to be taken off the programme completely. So that's B57 at 12 o'clock. If you go across to B58, you might be wondering why it's there in red. It's in red just to highlight the fact that you're no longer in IT3. If you look at it column-wise, you might presume that it is the same place. If you come down to 12:30 then, and here we will have the panel discussion in this room. Immediately outside the Douglas Hyde and to the left will be the space for the dance. And the exhibition, posters and Twitter competition will be out in the area where where all the displays are at the moment, just out to your right. Now, what I would ask too is that during the day, if you tweet out any exciting things that you find, please. There are communities of people who, for one reason or another, couldn't join us today and who are watching that tweet and are anxious to see what's going on because they feel very deprived not being here with us. So without further ado, thank you very much. Enjoy your day, and the chats will be wonderful. 11 o'clock for coffee, just in case you're wondering. Thank you.
Should I be using that one? Okay.
No, that's the rolling one, yeah.
I always have a tendency with that one to forget when they're talking.
Yeah, you can stay on it.
I have that tendency to wander away. I forget because I'm not used to having a mic, so I'm just used to teaching. So and yeah. Last year was awful. Just, I remember last year I kept running away from it and kept not talking into it. So I know.
That one, just use that. Are you? What's the format?
Okay, so I have Catherine and Rebecca and who else? I have Pat and Mags. Mags is in the back there. So there's 4 people sitting here and me just asking questions. Yeah, I asked them for a bigger table. Should I turn this one off or just so I don't? Should I turn this one?
Well, if you're just going to use that one, then
Yeah.
yeah, turn that off.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that no? That's all. Can I switch it? Yeah, thought I did. Test. Yeah. Yeah, because I know I tend to walk away from it. By accident.
My favourite spot.
Oh, do you know we're competing with blockchain through dance out there. They're actually going to do a ballet out there of blockchain.
Hang on now, in politics sometimes there's punching where the token female.
Will we leave him out on the edge? Will we? The token male. Here, get in there, token male. Okay.
We're going to be friends.
Ain't nothing token about Mr. Seaver.
Becca.
Sorry. This is.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
These days are always a bit frenetic, aren't they?
Okay. Yeah. That's very handy.
In a good way. In a good way.
Yes. I'm very glad.
People are going like this.
They're videoing the blockchain dance outside. So.
So we're not missing out.
That's
I'm
good.
curious as to how that'll work.
Brian,
Well,
very
I
strange.
love this. We were at Scratch and Bordeaux.
great.
One of the girls did an incredible dance with 67 people. It was for bubble sort or the various sort of sortings. It was mayhem for 15 minutes and then just beauty and slow for 10 minutes. But these are choreographed ballet. These are professional dancers out here.
Been done in New York.
Yeah. So Mary is. They're having it videoed so we can watch it.
No, I don't think she is. Is she?
Richard has set up the informal video, but Mary's
Oh, right.
actually videoing it. But officially they don't mind.
Because I saw something a number of years ago, and it had to do with Cooper pairs of electrons.
Yeah.
And what happens is you've got electrons seem to be randomly moving through a conductor, but actually they're paired off. And what they did, first of all, they did this dance, a large number of dancers, all wearing white.
I don't have my green thing on.
And it just seemed like purely, completely random. And then what they did was they paired off the dancers wearing the same colour. So the two wearing red, two wearing green, two wearing blue. And suddenly you saw the how each dancer, each pair matched each other's movements, but mirror movements.
Yes, yes.
And suddenly it all made sense. And what had seemed at first to be total random movement was something of simplicity but beauty. You know, in terms of this, and it was a very, very nice way of trying to.
So we can see our questions. That's good. There are questions. Okay. There are questions.
I'm
There
pleading
are
the fifth.
questions. There was homework.
Are there any answers?
You're a horrible teacher, Miss Malloy. Where's that nice teacher who was? Where's that nice teacher who was in Summerhill?
We could do. We could do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one or the other. Can't do both. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
God, I love Brian's pen work. It's just so lovely.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
It's just such. It's so lovely. Brian's pen work and stroke.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So
He
beautiful.
was overdoing. There was a summit in the UK on Wikipedians in
He probably
in
was.
education.
Yes,
he was
I
doing
think
that
so.
as well.
Yeah. He's in the room somewhere.
There he is.
Okay.
Yeah, he's up there. We're talking about you.
We're talking about you. You
Yeah,
can hear
yes.
us.
All good. All good.
Okay. Are we?
Except the bad bits.
Are we okay? Did you? Yeah, we're good. Okay. Hi, folks. Thanks very much for coming to our panel discussion here today. I know we're competing against an exciting dance happening outside and poster competitions. The reason we're hosting this panel, and I want to get to the conversation quickly, so I won't take up much of your time, is that we created some visual thinkery for CESI this past year, and one of the images that emerged was this image that around open asynchronous professional development that Brian Mathers has drawn for us, and you'll see more of his art in the keynote. We looked at it and wanted to illustrate it for our own purposes, but when we looked at the meaning behind it, we decided to make it openly licensed for everyone to use, because this work is not unique to CESI. This work is happening across the country and across the world. So without further ado, I will let my panel introduce themselves, and we're just going to loosely talk about a couple of questions. We'll probably won't have too much time for questions afterwards, so I'd encourage you to talk at lunch and keep the discussion moving informally. So I'm delighted to be joined by Mags Ammond, Catherine Cronin, Rebecca O'Neill, and Pat Seaver. And just to give you a flavour of, this is the newly launched image that we're really happy to share, so feel free to use it with attribution. So our first question for the panel: in what ways are educators across Ireland facilitating open asynchronous professional development? So maybe if you folks would introduce yourselves and give your take on that question.
Okay, we'll go alphabetical.
Very good.
We had a really good discussion about this. I'm Mags Ammond, and I am CESI long-term member, and I'm doing a PhD at the moment on TeachMeet, which is open professional development, hence my interest in this. And I would say CESI is quite to the fore in leading open educational asynchronous development, but I'll pass the introductions around before I go on for 3 hours.
Okay. All right, I'm trying to get the alphabetical order right. My name is Catherine Cronin, and I work at the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Much of my work is in the area of open education. So I love this whole notion of open asynchronous professional development, and obviously this room is all the people who are converted to that because you're here on Saturday. But yes, I'll talk more and maybe some examples from the National Forum as well, but I'll continue with the introductions.
Oh, goes next. so I have to run through the alphabet in my head, embarrassingly. So my name is Rebecca O'Neill. I am the project coordinator for Wikimedia Community Ireland, which is the recognised affiliate of the Wikimedia Foundation in Ireland, so the charity behind Wikipedia and all of its sister projects. I suppose from my point of view, my doctorate was in kind of digital curation through digital media, so the idea of people bringing together sources and information on platforms and in ways that were useful to them. And Wikipedia, in particular Wikimedia Commons, can be a host for if you are creating open license content that you want to share with others in I suppose, a very stable and a platform that hopefully will be around for quite a number of years and isn't going to be locked down like Flickr or something like that, is definitely a place that you can safely store some content that you're developing or using. But equally, it gives you a platform to deal with perhaps professionals that are in adjacent roles to you, like librarians or information professionals, that kind of thing.
Excuse me, can I suggest maybe that people use the microphone, because
Do we need to get?
we might be missing some of the...
Is it very? Okay,
or
maybe
even
a
maybe
little closer.
Just pass between each other.
Okay, backing band 2 and 2. Thanks,
Sorry
Tom.
about that.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, my name is Pat Seaver. I'm obviously alphabetically challenged. I'm a teacher with enthusiasm for IT and education, ICT and education. Probably more enthusiasm than competence, but that's another story. If we talk about asynchronous professional development, my first reaction is, it was ever thus. We have been developing ourselves professionally through snatched conversations in the staff room, over a cup of coffee, over lunches at the organised professional development sessions that we get, conversations over lunch or whatever at events such as this. But the difference now is that we have more platforms, where it's possible, a term that I heard echoed only this morning at breakfast time, finding our tribe. The technology is now allowing us to do things and to reach a far greater audience, but also to be able to learn from far more people because of the technology. And that's what makes it different, and that's what makes it, I think, more exciting.
Well, I'm going to jump right in there and shout out for the CESI Asynchronous Professional Development, because I think we have to give a vote of thanks to John Hegarty. About 12 years ago, John took us down the open source path and the Linux path when he set up our new CESI list. He was using the Irish Linux Users Group model. And for me, that's the day that really, really valuable asynchronous professional development started for me. I mean, 24/7, I had to tap into the most incredible PD of my life in terms of EdTech anyway. So I don't even think he's in the room, because I think is he here? No. Yeah, he's actually still working on his sewing machine somewhere, or he could be dancing. But if you meet him later on, shake his hand.
Thank you, folks. Again, drawing on some of Brian's visuals, and actually taps in nicely to what Mags is talking about with John's work on that mailing list, that we sketched out some of the work that CESI does, but also applicable to the work of, let's say, Wikimedia or to the National Forum, that what does this open asynchronous professional development look like? And I think Pat was touching on that to some degree, but I'd like to open that to the panel, that what does it look like? What does it look like in practice across the country?
I might just give a personal answer and then my National Forum answer. So my personal answer would be, I suppose from 10, 11 years ago, Twitter and EdChat.ie was how I found a lot of the people in this room and found my way to CESI. So I have to give a nod to that. And then the successive waves as your interest, develops into other things and you find Wikimedians and, whatever else you might be interested in. Next week, for example, is Open Education Week. So the hashtag OE Week. You will find a wealth of, webinars and conversations and Twitter chats and all kinds of things if you want to learn a little bit more about open licensing, open educational practices, open pedagogies, whatever. And that's just one example. So for me, as you were saying, finding networks of people who I can learn from and be emboldened by to change my own practice has just been instrumental. And it's mostly informal, and it's open, and it's asynchronous. For the last year and a bit, I've been working for the National Forum, and that's at the Twitter hashtag is ForumTL for teaching and learning, and the website is teachingandlearning.ie. And the forum developed something called a professional development framework a few years ago. And all of the resources for that are open. So open.courses on the National Forum website, you can find courses on universal design for learning, teaching online, whatever. And those are small, openly licensed, CC licensed modules that people can do, because the people in the National Forum, and again, this predated me, recognize that accreditation is important, but it's not important for all people, and it's not important for all things. So these kind of small, bite-sized bits of learning that you can do in your own time as part of a CPD course with a pal, and the whole notion of openness and open licensing just unlocks that and means that anybody can access it, across all sectors of education, and anyone who has access to the web. So I can talk more about that, but those are kind of two different things.
From the Wikimedia perspective, and it's a challenge when you talk about kind of the embarrassment of channels that you can have, is actually, yes, your tribe probably exists, but where do you find them? And which channel are they in? And that will be, obviously, there'll be a certain amount of history to that, whether or not somebody is comfortable with mailing lists and are not comfortable with social media postings, or if you have a professional that's just emerged and they're really engaged with TikTok and Snapchat, and they're only going to be talking to peers that are comfortable on certain platforms. And that's something that, from the international Wikimedia point of view, is quite challenging. We know there's an awful lot of really interesting work going on, but where is it documented and how can I find it? They're not always necessarily logically placed sometimes. It's part of a huge strategy that we've been doing in the Wikimedia Foundation to actually better map and better understand the variety of activity that's happening internationally. And even I know in Ireland there are teachers that are using Wikipedia in the classroom who have never heard of Wikimedia Community Ireland and don't know that the support is there. So there's kind of known unknowns and unknown unknowns when it comes to these things. So I think quite often, when it comes to the role that groups like CESI and the Teaching and Learning Forum can have is also as aggregators and as signposters. So actually saying this is where the conversations are happening. And that has to be quite an active process because it is going to be changing all of the time.
I think that probably segues nicely into the next question.
Well, can I?
Sorry, Max.
Well, no, credit also has to be given, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years, to the, what would I call them, the official channels for professional development in the country have really embraced social media as well. So when I want to go and find out what JCT is doing or PDST, I still go to Twitter and I can find it on their timeline. So, okay, they have to provide synchronous, correctly checked professional development, but it's really good to see them embrace the channels to find teachers and draw us in.
Thank you, Mags. So as we come back to the actual conference theme and looking at our evolving landscape of learning, in terms of open asynchronous professional development, I just wanted to get the panel's reaction that how they see that landscape of what you were discussing really in the last question. How do we see it evolving past 2020? What developments do you see on the horizon?
Well, I think that Rebecca touched on it just a few minutes ago. We're probably going from one extreme where there were absolutely no outlets maybe 20 years ago for a teacher or an enthusiast within a school to find like-minded souls. Now we have the opposite problem, whereas Rebecca said there is a plethora of channels. There's a multitude of platforms. And I think part of how this landscape will evolve is I don't think we really know yet. I mean, I was talking at the coffee break just about learning platforms, learning management systems. And somebody says, do you remember when Edmodo was going to take over everything? And there's another person who said what? They'd never heard it, that Edmodo had bypassed them completely. So in terms of how the landscape is changing, I don't know what it's going to be. But what I love about the graphic that Brian has there is this whole notion of there's certain obstacles, there's certain things we can see in the distance. We're not quite sure how we're going to get there, but I think we've guiding principles that act like pole stars that will help us navigate whatever way we make it through there. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I think we will continue to develop very, very strong systems. We will have very, very powerful communities. I think in the future, continuous professional development will be asynchronous, and it will be continuous. But I have no idea as to what it's going to look like.
It's your job, Catherine. You have to answer this one.
Again, I have a personal reaction first, and the learning from each other. I think it's, we tend to answer in ways that are just the nice ways. Oh, it's great. I was able to learn about this, or I learned about another educator doing that. But sometimes learning is uncomfortable, and I think when it's open and asynchronous and global, we can face up to some of what makes us uncomfortable. So, dominant knowledge structures in society are gendered. There tend to be white, male, Western voices in our history textbooks and in the newspapers and on the web and so on. And being parts of networks where we can engage with people and stories that are often on the margins is really powerful. So even just on this panel this morning, a term that I used until about a year ago was find my tribe. I thought that was, it speaks to me. And I learned through my networks that, Indigenous people or Indigenous rights find that appropriates a word that is very significant for them. So I don't use that anymore. And we can think of lots of examples of that. And it doesn't come from badness. I mean, as I said, I did it until a year ago myself. So I think the notion of learning from each other and being open can often expose some things that make us uncomfortable, but that's really powerful learning. And then when we share that with our peers and our students, we can kind of extend that. So that's the first thing that strikes me about that, and I don't think that we should forget that. The nice stories are wonderful, but being able to face up to our own gendered, racist, colonialist sometimes patterns of how we were educated and raised ourselves, and kind of unearth some of those, and really ideas that don't serve us anymore is part of what open asynchronous professional development can help us to do.
I might add one more flag to that picture that Brian has drawn, because I think with the growth and the validation of things like the CESI list, Wikipedia now, I think there's something for everybody on the right, but also something from everybody, that our professional development, as we move on, I have something to offer everyone in this room, but everybody else has as well. And the asynchronous model of going into a platform and browsing and looking and seeing, you will get something from everybody. It's a two-way street, that for everything you get, the more you get, you hopefully will tend to give a little bit back. So one up for your platform, Rebecca, and I'll let you have the next word.
Getting a lot of love today, which is unusual sometimes in a room. The thing that I would add to this is that I know there's an awful lot in the Wikimedia contents, but also across all teaching, is that there's really interesting projects being done, but quite often the energy that sustains those projects, the kind of the extracurricular stuff that goes into it, it doesn't get sustained into documentation and dissemination. So the stuff is happening. It's really, cutting edge. It's really exciting. It's really engaging, but nobody else knows about it, because by the time you've gotten to the end of it, you don't have the energy to let other people know about it. So it's one of the things with the Wikimedia Foundation is actually documentation and ease of discoverability are the two main issues that we have. And I think within this we have to make space for either providing the capacities for people or giving them aids for documentation or ease of platform or toolkits that they can work with. But I think enabling people to have the time and the space and the capacity to document their failings as well as their successes, I think is very important and very powerful within this space.
Thank you, folks. And I'm just realizing as I stand up here, I kind of wish I didn't volunteer to chair it, because I could be taking notes or tweeting all these great ideas, and now I'm just thinking about racing to lunch and jotting down a few ideas myself, because that's the joy of having to be the MC. Because we're actually keeping to time, we're quite proud of ourselves today. Are there any final thoughts from our panelists, or would anyone like to take a question? Again, keeping this as a nice informal panel discussion. Are there any final thoughts maybe first, or questions? Final thoughts? Yes, please. I have a wireless mic, I think. deliver it to you.
Well, I was going to say, I see several people here who are teacher trainers who are working in the initial teacher training area, and I love what's happening now in a lot of those areas. You are now teaching your baby teachers before they come out into the real world to be in charge of their own professional development. Have you got any ideas or thoughts or anything? I'm looking at several people in particular, but won't name anybody. Just wondering how you're feeling about teaching them about the future of their professional development before they enter the profession formally, if they get a job.
I can see the blockchain music is starting to try to drown us out, so let's compete.
I think we have to, excuse me, I just have a small cold. I haven't been in northern Italy and I haven't been on a train or I haven't been on a plane. But just letting you know I'm fine, it's just your average cold. So excuse me for starting off with this sore throat kind of thing. Well, firstly, I think there's a really significant issue happening to us, and that is that education is changing in rapid areas all of the time. And I'm looking particularly at the early childhood educators in Ireland. I'm looking particularly at how they lay the foundations for the children that come into us in primary and then on to post-primary and then in tertiary education. And one of the things I think which is quite important is that we value them for what they bring to us in the first instance. When we write programs, or when we begin to write programs for teacher ITE, we know what the system needs, or we think we do. But actually, because of its rapid changing nature, future-proofing education for initial teacher education is a very difficult thing. And I think sometimes what we are not doing is we rely too much on the old ways, on the old things that we've done. And I think one of the challenges for me in writing a Level 8 early childhood programme was that who are these teachers of the future? Because it's not me today, it's the teacher of the future. And bringing them to an understanding that they are in charge of their own learning, by means of communicating with others, with parents, means that we have to have less of maybe a developmental approach to what's happening and more of a sociological approach, more of a, this is about relationships. This is more, it's not about the functionality of something, it is actually about the relationship that we are building as educators together. And so I hope that helps somewhat.
It's all relational.
You can answer, you know, or
No, I think you've put your finger on it. It's all relational.
oh, come on, John. Oh, come on, John. He purposely waited for me to do that.
This is another man whose fault it all is. He got us all on Twitter 10 years ago.
It's actually about Twitter I want to talk about. Should we make it mandatory for teachers to have a Twitter account? To kind of engage with, I'm just trying as a question to get started here, but one of the things that myself and Darren had talked about before is that when you have a model of professional development that's very school-based, where circular coaches, LTIs, that learning happens in conversations the whole time. We don't have that model here, but we need to come up with a way that we can digitally connect people. Because if you're a teacher in a small two-teacher school in North Mayo, you're not going to meet many teachers apart from the person at the other end of the corridor. And unless that person is really engaged with technology online, the conversations you're having are going to be about sick kids and puking puppies in the corridor, in the schoolyard. We need to connect people. People probably have to be motivated to kind of connect, whether or not we can kind of intensify, kind of to motivate them to kind of use technology is a hard part to do, but we need to kind of come up with a way of doing it, because if they're happy enough to kind of sit in their own classroom and not be willing to get outside those walls, there's not a whole lot the outside world's going to do to get inside those walls.
So I want to add a little bit to what John just said. I think overall, especially if you're thinking of a teacher who's coming straight out of college, to get them to think about how when they're starting something new, not to go it alone, right? If you're going to try and start a fire and you have one single spark landing in a place where there's no fuel, nothing's going to happen except for that spark's going to die. And so that person could be an instructional coach, it could be an LTI, it could also be another teacher, right? And if you have that small community that is your physical community where you go to work, maybe you can reach out through Twitter and find somebody who you can partner with and swap stories, war stories, stories of success, and getting those students who are coming out and going in as new teachers to understand that they don't have to feel alone, even if they're going into some place that is tiny.
Okay, could I just say one quick response, because I don't know how much time we have left. I concur entirely with you, Darren, that we need to have communities built. We need to encourage. My primary concern is that top-down systems like forcing people to use a particular platform or a particular technology, no matter how much we like and we think it's great. I think if we have an evolving landscape, we have to let it evolve, and we have to let whichever platforms, whichever modes of communication bubble to the top to allow them to flourish, rather than trying to force people to use one platform, one type of technology rather than another. That'd be my philosophy, at least.
Okay, I had two ladies waiting for questions, and we did start 2 or 3 minutes late, so I think we have enough time to navigate that.
Hi, my name is Anya. I'm a student teacher. I'm just wondering, why Twitter? I don't know anybody on Twitter. Myself, I'm not on Twitter.
10 years ago, 128 characters was the limit.
Right.
So it had to be short and sweet, and
But
it was
that's not the
really,
case now.
really, it was like bite-sized. But it was the global thing. Through a hashtag, I could maybe converse with a teacher in Florida over something we were both interested in. It was the brevity and the immediacy of it, to me, was quite...
That was 10 years ago.
Yes,
What
I know,
about now?
I know. Now it's gone to 280. Now it's getting a bit, it's getting a bit woolly, and I may rethink what I'm doing, but the hashtag is still, it's the hashtag-driven thing that's
But why
great,
not
Anya.
Instagram or Facebook?
Say again?
Why not Instagram or Facebook?
Well, I would use Insta and I would not use Facebook. So I think it's a very personal thing. That's why I worry about John's idea of making it mandatory. I think it has to be personal, it has to be your context.
But like, say me, no, I'm not on Twitter.
Okay,
None
so
of my friends are, and
I'll find you on Insta then, if hopefully later on.
yeah. And is Instagram and Twitter being used by?
And I don't know about Snapchat. I don't know if that's come or gone.
TikTok.
No,
Yeah.
students.
We'll meet on TikTok later.
Well, yeah,
I
was
rest
gonna-
my case, Your Honour.
Yeah, well, I was.
Comes in waves.
Aside from Insta, like what other? And I feel so incongruous saying Insta.
I know.
And I'm 35. Like, oh, it's painful. Yeah. Mailing lists. So where would if you were looking for a community of
I'd look
peers.
on Facebook or Instagram. I wouldn't go near Twitter. I don't know.
That's
No.
interesting because most people I know of my age would consider that nobody under the age of 25 is on Facebook anymore, or is really engaging with it. So
Okay.
there's obviously
well, my age group are engaging
Yeah.
in Facebook,
Okay.
and I'm over the age of 25. So,
But I think that's a great question. I mean, I would always start those conversations in asking, where are the conversations that you want to be a part of?
yeah.
And
Like
then
if I want to be a part of a certain conversation, it means I have to join Twitter, and I'm only joining it just to be a part of the conversation. I'm not joining it for any other reason, so I
that-
wouldn't go on it regularly then. So
that's the question. And then for ourselves and our peers and our students, helping people to just assess the various platforms and where those conversations are happening, thinking about digital identity, and not whether you want to be on those platforms, but how you want to be on those platforms, how visible, how active, and so on. And that's really the kind of digital literacies that are more important than being on Twitter or being on X or being on Y. So, but great questions, and would love to chat after.
thank you for the response.
Okay.
What's new?
Devil's advocate.
Really quick.
I'll be really quick. I just think it's very important that you take a step back and not even talk about platforms and just talk about the people. And I think it's no coincidence that the type of people who are involved in CESI are also the type of people who engage in open conversation, informal CPD, the chat at the, over a cuppa in the staff room. And, that's how you start this conversation. You're speaking about initial teacher education. That's where we should start. And remind people around us that we're not afraid to make mistakes, and that trialing things is the first step, and subtly introducing change is the best way forward for us. Making content or approaches mandatory, it's something I'm very wary of. Just conversations, being open, sharing practice. It's exactly what Teach Meet, for example, is all about. That open sharing, we all benefit from it. Wikipedia is no different. Providing these platforms, but maybe starting with a conversation. And that's where we need to begin. We're all here and we're all going to be on those platforms, but it's the people who aren't on the platforms who aren't here that we need to really be worried about and be concerned about today. So that's where we need to take this conversation.
Thanks very much, Ciara. I am conscious that it's about 1:05. Were there any burning questions, Brian? Sorry, simplest way to do this.
To be honest, I'd like to just reinforce the last speaker's opinion on this, because I go to a lot of these events, I hear people talking about gee whiz technology, about sophisticated pedagogies, and even ethics. When in actual fact, I think I've spent the last 20 years trying to convince people teaching just to get up onto the first rung of the ladder. Avoided sophisticated technologies, avoided sophisticated pedagogies. Let's just do this in the simplest way possible, get started. And really, it was said it was about people. I suppose it's about culture, really. It's about changing. I just feel that that's where we should be putting our efforts in, is changing the culture, changing the attitude, everybody's attitude towards using technology. And I just don't feel we make progress once we start debating whether it's Twitter or Facebook or things like that, or even sophisticated pedagogies, I'm afraid, as well, that basically if we could do simple things using technology, we can make a lot of progress. So we need to change how people think about them.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'm just conscious of the time because we're eating into lunch. Are there burning questions or? Okay, and I'd like, for the live stream, you have to use the microphone, sorry, and for accessibility purposes.
No, I suppose where is it all going is one of the questions, and then the idea of asynchronous and synchronous. I suppose recently I've completed two MOOCs. One was a data analytics MOOC on education data analytics, and that was asynchronous. And it was all about sort of harvesting data from different platforms and so on. But it was asynchronous and it wasn't engaging. While on the other hand, I also was working, it wasn't a MOOC, but something quite similar, on mindfulness for a Spanish community. And there it was asynchronous, and it was also synchronous insofar as that we had WhatsApp, and we also had a video conference once or twice a week. And to compare the two, I mean, on one hand, the education data analytics is a new course, a 100-hour course involving a lot of educational technologists, people that are creating online content and so on. I was expecting them to produce something a lot more dynamic, and they didn't. I mean, forums were kind of optional, and at the end it was just doing assessment. It was like a 4-hour assessment, whereas the other one is much, much more dynamic. So in the future, I see more and more, we spoke about diversity earlier on, the idea of reaching out to more people, but and reaching out to more people in different places that might want to sit in Connemara doing a master's in Harvard or wherever, and that the content then, or if use the word content, the engagement is dynamic, and that for me is an important direction to go. And I know that in creating engaging content is expensive, and sometimes I see, in the case of the data analytics course, I see a focus on data analytics, but not so much on engagement.
Just have a very quick response to that, is that quite often, in my experience, the people who are attempting to maybe engage with these learning platforms, they, and maybe not, forums are optional, other outlets are optional. Quite often they're quite strained when it comes to time and capacity anyway. We see this all the time in the Wikimedia Foundation. They're always trying to run little like Google Hangouts that are, show and tell and things like that. And they're trying to make it as international as possible, but for me it's usually at 8 o'clock at night, and I've just done 7 hours of Wikimedia stuff, and I don't want to spend my evening listening, as interesting as it might be to see what somebody's doing in India. I've kind of reached my level for the day. So I think there has to be a certain amount of, I suppose, compassion within that as well, that, you have to understand that while people are very engaged and very motivated, that drawing people to waypoints within, synchronized learning outputs or congregations, you do have to realize that it's kind of within a landscape they're probably quite stretched anyway. And there's no good answer to it, yeah, unfortunately.
And I believe on that note, there are no simple answers. And I hate to plug for social media, because I'm not a social media evangelist, but if you want to continue the conversation, 8:30 to 9:30 on Monday night is EdChat.ie, and we do meet on Twitter to have these discussions in the open. And for some of us, I know we wouldn't know each other or be part of this community without that. So it's really powerful in that respect. And I do not want to keep you from lunch anymore, so I appreciate your time, and I want to thank my panelists very, very much for their time and for their effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Luncheon. Food.
With multiple fascinating, challenging and informative meetings, discussions, presentations, workshops, whirly things, all sorts of stuff going on. We come to our capstone presentation, and all of you at this stage have seen some of Brian's work because it has been featuring on the CESI website. Katie introduced us to visual thinkery, and we all looked at her and said, pardon? In the politest form of the word. So I am not going to in any way attempt to preempt what Brian might say. I'm simply going to introduce him to you. Brian.
Yeah, thank you for staying around. We're a skeleton crew, but I know that's because the tickets to this were very expensive, this last bit. So I just really appreciate you shelling out for the finale, I suppose. Yeah, look, I'm really pleased to come and speak to you. They never seem to make things high enough here, in terms of. But hopefully you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, is it good? Lovely. Okay. But yeah, it's a real privilege to come and speak with you. It's actually been great to hang around last night at the Teach Meet and to just sort of eavesdrop into some of the conversations. And obviously it's just lovely to come back home to Ireland anyway, because I'm based in London, and to compare histories, I suppose. Because as I get older, I realise that the history that I inherited growing up in the north is a very strange and narrow Irish history. And therefore, by having conversations with fellow Irish people, I get to broaden that history and learn some things. And so, I'm really appreciative of that. Anyway, today I'm going to talk to you about a big bag of craziness, which is visual thinkery, because you'll have noticed the. I'm going to do this off an iPad. I haven't presented off an iPad before, but we'll see how it goes. You'll have seen some of the imagery around, hopefully. And I'd like to say that I created that imagery, and in some ways I did, but it was very collaborative. I have a collaborative process. Essentially, everything I create comes from conversation, comes from dialogue, okay? And usually, whenever I get a bunch of people together, and I got a few of the CESI exec together to create this artwork, but whenever I get people together, I'm generally asking 3 questions. I'm asking, what are you trying to say? Who are you trying to say it to? And why are you saying it? right? So that generally underpins all of the stuff that I create, okay? And even today, I've been sort of listening into, this is from the keynote this morning, and just a little thing just stuck in my head, just the mention of soft power and what Cornelia meant by that, you know what I mean, or what I take that meaning to be. Before too long, I'm scribbling at my sketchbook and I'm creating something. I thought I would just sort of dip in and try to put together some of the things I've come across just for last night and today. So from sort of turtle stitching, which I had no idea such a thing existed, to blockchain by dance, you know what I mean, which was an experience by itself, But also, I think in some of the conversations that I've had with individuals, this gender problem that we sometimes recognise, you know who I'm looking at there in some of the offline conversations, and guerrilla CPD, somebody mentioned yesterday, and I thought, that's an interesting term, I need to think more about that, or quite often I'll try to sit and think of what are all the things, can I put them together, what meaning can I take from it? But the story that I'm going to tell you is one of latent potential, because I haven't been drawing for that long. My background's software engineering, this visual thinkery is definitely a story of latent potential. It's like somehow I've found a part of myself that I didn't know was there. And essentially, I had grown a software company and sold it to an organization called City and Guilds. And I found myself inside City and Guilds, which is a very political organization inside. And I was used to sort of a startup, it was greater than the sum of its parts. And all of a sudden, there's a different game being played, and I have no idea how to play that game. And somebody introduced me to drawing on an iPad. Drawing on an iPad's really forgiving, because you can undo if it doesn't work out. You know what I mean? So if you draw something, oh, that's not quite right, undo, and until you sort of get it right. And so I remember I was fighting with the IT department at that time, you know what I mean? Because I was trying to sort of say, look, IT in an organization is very different from building products for customers, which is outside the organization. So if you don't stand in the shoes of your customers, you're really going to be throwing technology at them rather than trying to make their lives simpler, right? So I was trying to have this conversation and not making a very good job of it. And anyway, I decided to sort of take a more visual approach, and it just went down really well, right? In fact, since then, nobody's told me to stop, and that's sort of how I've got here, right? But before too long, I also realized that if you send someone a visual of an idea, it sort of stays the way it is. It sort of hangs around. So I could send the board of City and Guilds a visual idea, and it still had my fingerprints on it, and it appeared on their presentations, rather than if you did that using sentences. And I thought, that's really interesting. And then people started asking me to translate their stuff into images, so I started to do that as well. And then I started to go to conferences like the Alt Conference, and again, just from a curious point of view, try to pick up. And Catherine Cronin was one of my early victims. Trying to just dial into something that she's saying, and turn it into an image and share it on Twitter. And when everyone else is sharing sentences on Twitter and you're sharing images, you win. That's how it goes. And then I realized, hold on a minute. What about sort of connecting with other people? I don't know if you're aware of Sir Ken Robinson. Anyway, I came across a little video he had done with another person, and just something that he said really struck me. He was talking about creativity in schools, and I created something and I tweeted it at him, and sure enough, he retweeted it, right? And I at that point had 300 followers. He has 120,000 followers, and all of a sudden there's people going, "Oh, I really like that." And Twitter became a really important part in that validation journey. It also became a big trap, because if you get to the point where you're only creating stuff, in your head it's only good if people retweet it. That's a hole. You know what I mean? You don't want to be there. So, but that's the journey to becoming an artist, where the idea, and it took me years before I called myself an artist, but the idea of being an artist is saying, I create what I will create, and I hope people find meaning in it. But if they don't, that's okay, right? And that was a big step forward for me. Anyway, I'm already rambling, as you can see. This could go on for hours, and if it does, just throw things at me, right? But it's also, this story I'm telling you is also a journey of my Achilles heel becoming my superpower. And I'll explain what I mean by that later on. By the way, this is, I usually draw using Procreate on the iPad. And recently in Procreate 5, they've just added a little bit of animation to that. So you can do little animations like this really easy. In fact, if I can just switch to it, I'll show you it. Let's see, here's Procreate. Let's go back in here. So this is my animation, and essentially it allows you to do what's called onion skinning, all right? Which is essentially, I've got two frames here, but it allows you to see the little grayness of the Achilles heel and the superpower. It allows you to see what the previous frame is and what the next frame is, and so if I flick to one frame, you see it just changes it, and so if I press play there, and you see that's just sort of flicking between two, and as we were the last session I was in was the GeoGebra. Making something move, bringing something to life, almost just gives it a different feel, doesn't it? It allows you to take different meaning from it. Right, anyway, back to this presentation. That's enough distraction there. Right, good. Lovely. But this journey has taken me in some really interesting places because one of my early clients, which was Reclaim Hosting, really taught me a lot about aesthetic. And the fact that aesthetic, you can absorb aesthetic. In fact, you absorb aesthetic before your conscious brain, processes something. It's an amazing power if you can use aesthetic and give a feeling to something. Ideas, what makes a good idea? I still fascinate about that question, because I found that your first idea is often the most obvious idea, and as often isn't the strongest idea. And you've got to really dig under the surface to get to get something that is really strong. So playing around with sort of ideas and sort of a design thinking approach has really helped. Identity and branding, is something I've played a lot with. In terms of, I've seen my artwork. People have created a lot of stickers and T-shirts and all sorts, really. But when someone says, I am this, you know what I mean? I identify with this. What are they saying? What do they really mean by that? How can you create stuff that people will do that too? The use of metaphor. Obviously, creating things that people will recognize already because of the metaphors that you use. Creating a visual language that then can be used to, create 1,000 more things. And then also sort of just really starting to get underneath comics and cartoons and how some of these things have existed for so long and I really haven't paid them any attention. And there's so much to learn from this stuff. So as you can tell, I'm a fairly curious chap. But the more you look at this stuff, the more there is to see, which is sort of generally the case. In fact, this is generally my process. You notice something and it makes you, oh, wonder what, and that just makes you notice more things, and there's this sort of this cycle that continues. But over the time, I've created a process of working with the clients that I work with. And I went through this process with the CESI exec, right? And I'll explain a little bit about what this process or how it works. Because it all starts in conversation. It all starts in asking the right questions, creating the space for those questions to be answered, or for people to think out loud, or for people to be open about the stuff that's in their heads. And that's easier said than done, because quite often when you get people together, there are some loud voices and some quiet voices. There are people who are quite happily interrupting anybody else. There are people who are empowered and people who are disempowered, and therefore being able to facilitate a conversation and really, really unearth what people are. The amount of times I will switch to someone who hasn't said much, and they'll start with the line, "This probably doesn't make any sense, but," and I know that there's a good idea there, because it's usually that person hasn't been given that opportunity, or hasn't the confidence, but that there is something golden in there, you know? So actually being able to ask the right questions, create that space, and get people to talk openly. And often I record that. So I work with people all over the world, and I use Zoom. It works really well in terms of just auto-recording a session. It's really weird, by the way, because whenever then you go through and look for those visual ideas, it means by the time I then see the client again, I've sort of memorized that conversation, so I can remember the little things they've said and stuff. It's a bit weird. Anyway, but I think this is where my gift actually lies, because it's listening. It's not drawing. It's listening. It's being able to tune into what someone's saying, because people say things in lots of different ways. Not just by the words that come out of their mouths, but by their body language, by how they react to things, and that's why I'm fascinated by dialogue in terms of people and that interplay between people. But also, then, the things that when we do talk, or when I go back through a conversation, the silly ideas that your mind pops up, because your mind's sort of just making little connections all the time. And you can develop a way or a habit of seeing those more clearly. So generally, I'm always interested in humor, right? Humor is like a signpost that points to just little bits of gold, right? I'm interested in metaphor. People use metaphors all the time. And you can really tune into, what does that metaphor mean? Why are they using that metaphor? Even though it's just off the cuff, they're not thinking about it, but it's just there. And then having the bravery, because drawing is about bravery. It's about starting with a blank piece of something and making a mark. Often whenever people see the things I've created, they're looking at the thing that's at the end of that process. But it doesn't start there. It starts with just committing something to a piece of paper that then starts to speak to you if you listen to it, and it'll start telling you what it needs to be. And it's a very curious thing, but it's a journey. It's not an outcome, right? But drawing and putting stuff out there is bravery. And most people will tell you. Like I've had conversations just in the last 2 days. I can't draw for toffee. I've never been able to draw. I'm not a creative at all. I'm not artistic. I'm not. And there's a starting point which basically says I'm not. And I don't buy that for a minute. I really don't. Because one thing I do know is that if you do something every day, you can't help but get better at it. Okay? And I know that, yes, it's more complicated than that, and lots of things go into how people create stuff. But that I have found to be true, okay? But the other thing that bothers me about drawing and people's mindset, because it is a mindset, is that you're denying me access to your insight. Because if you could get from listening to seeing to drawing to be able to commit something, I could benefit from that, because I'm convinced that this room and the heads in this room are all different because of the experiences that each person has had, and therefore the insights that just bubble up, that seem obvious to you but aren't obvious to other people, are actually worthwhile if you could share them. And drawing is a really good way, you know, or being able to make that visual is a very powerful way of being able to do that. Anyway, so here's some examples of some of the stuff I created. Again, one of the early ones was Audrey Waters. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Audrey's work, but like I had a 1 hour conversation with Audrey. And I remember it so well because it was one of those ones where the technology totally failed me. And I'm just like, I can have an open conversation with Audrey here, and this is all being recorded, and then I go to the recording and there's no audio. What have I done? It was only me, and I couldn't hear Audrey. You know what I mean? It was a nightmare. Anyway, but I asked Audrey right at the end, it's just like, in one line, you know, what are you trying to say to the people that you're communicating to? And it was just flippant, but Audrey was just like, I suppose I'm just telling them to be less pigeon, you know. And I'm just like, that's the thing, there it is, grab it while it's there. And you know, and therefore we turned it into artwork. You know, I've done a lot of work with alt, and again, they're very membership oriented, very participatory oriented. And the artwork that I create for them often starts with who wants to be part of a session that we're going to talk about our values and what they mean to people, and we maybe do 2 or 3 calls, and we boil that down into a bunch of ideas that then turn into artwork. So it's the same process, but the people are the membership. But of course, those people can see the reflection of their conversation in the stuff that gets created. So it becomes something that people are happy to own, happy to wear, because it's theirs. I'm just the conduit. As I said, if you see my laptop, I've created so many stickers. Excuse me. But you know, here's the example. I'm borrowing from Roy Lichtenstein here. You know, obviously. But again, that's an aesthetic that people recognise that you can use. But I'm also, again, somebody said this as part of my in one of the calls that I had with a client. And again, it's a silly idea, but it's an idea that then resonated with other people. And when something resonates with other people, I know it has strength, and I know it's worth developing. You know, or even, you know, I grew up going to church, and I go to a community church in London, and I suppose I wrestle with it quite a bit. But having a pen in your hand and trying to just tune into what somebody's saying in that regard as well, I find is quite helpful, quite liberating. But again, you know, it's just the phrase "fresh hope," and I was just like, "What? Oh, that's just like a big thing of fresh milk," you know what I mean? And just and you go off on a little journey with, you know, whatever that becomes, and soon someone's asking you, "Well, can I make a T-shirt out of that?" Because that just really means something to me. Or even just an experience. So, you know, this is the process that essentially I went through giving this public talk. You know what I mean? Because there was a point in my life where I couldn't have given a talk to 5 people. Never mind, you know, 3,000 people that we have here. At least I'll pretend it's 3,000 people. But just, you know, this is the journey. Just somebody said it's a bit of a roller coaster ride, isn't it? And I'm like, that's exactly what it is, and I can visualize that. You know, well, you know, why am I doing it? Oh no, because I've got something to say, and I'm not prepared. And that's the thing. It's just like no, right, okay, let's get prepared, and I'm ready. And then there's a point where you get to where you're like, actually, I'm going to enjoy this. You know, and that nervousness turns into adrenaline, and anyway, that really helps me. But there's this constant monkey on my back that's just saying, "You're not good enough." You know, you don't have an arts degree. You didn't go to arts college. You know, you're just a software engineer. What do you know about creativity? Anyway, I did work recently with Open University, and I got them to talk about their Open program. And they were founded in 1969, obviously, and again, just trying to put things together that will mean things to them. But again, same process, that I got them talking about what that open degree meant to them. GoGN, this is a good example of sort of visual language, because again, it was just so lovely working with these people, I have to say. But the travel element of what they do, they're a very spread out group of researchers, I suppose, researchers in openness. And therefore borrowing from the aesthetic of the golden age of travel just seemed to really resonate with them. But once you've got that visual language, you can then go, all right, okay, well, what does a webinar ticket look like? You know, I mean, or what does an open guide look like? And the rest becomes just a lot easier because you've already got that visual language that resonates. And recently, it's got me into sort of illustrations for sort of book covers. This is a book that's just out. It's actually free on ebook if you're interested in it. 25 years of EdTech. But again, went through the same process of working with Martin to explore different ideas, and I suppose I'm mashing up a whole bunch of things here to grab your interest and to say something about maybe the false promises of EdTech. But one of the most interesting journeys that I've been on recently is to do with activism. I have found that if you get an activist or a couple of activists in a room and start them off with a question, they talk from here, right? Because they're not in it for the money. No activist is in it for the money. And the stuff that comes out is so rich with metaphor that my job is easy, right? Here's another one. And in contrast to that, politicians, what they say is so sterile, right? They have so much bluster and so much gusto, and yet their words, they're empty. There's nothing in them, right? And so I've really enjoyed working. So there's a whole bunch of organisations lobbying the European Parliament with regards to plastic pollution, with regards to single-use plastic. And I've really enjoyed working with them. It's one of the great sadnesses that I have about Brexit, and that because I can see the standards that are being constantly raised as a result of the European Parliament, as a result of countries working together and working and trying to not let the industry dominate. And I really fear for Britain in that, in terms of their poor decision making, shall we say? Anyway, but yeah, also trying to use humour. People don't want to be shouted at when it comes to activism, but you're trying. Humour disarms. So just the use of the straw, or the eye on that turtle looking at you, in terms of what that's saying, and just being exposed to the fact that there's a whole industry behind the whole plastic industry, which is very linked to the petrochemical industry, obviously, that really is building plants, and plastic production is, they have no intention of pulling back or cleaning up, I have to say. Anyway, don't get me started on that. Another sort of bunch of work that I do, and hopefully this will start to get relevant in a minute, but you'd probably call it graphic recording, and that's a different sort of game, because that's live recording of a conversation, okay? And that feels a lot more like a performance to me, because suddenly you're like, oh, here's a guy who's supposed to be able to draw, and he's recording what we're saying, it better be good. At least that's the monkey on my back again. But, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by graphic recording. So here's me listening to a lecture at Ada College talking about enterprise programming. And look, this is you could probably turn that into a resource in terms of how this lecturer sort of took these students through what enterprise programming actually is. But I'll show you a different conversation here. This is a dialogue. That last one is a monologue, and it has structure, and it is tidy, and it has a flow. But dialogue isn't like that. right? Dialogue's messy. And it's often why we stay away from it or feel uncomfortable with it. And it's harder to capture. But in there is and it might not actually mean that much to you, and that's okay. But to the people that were part of that conversation, they can recognize that, recognize the elements of that. And there's little ideas hidden in there that we then turned into artwork, right? And I suppose that what I'm getting to, what I'm getting at here is back to my superpower, which is listening, right? Essentially, when I was 5, my hair fell out. So since the age of 5, I haven't had any hair at all, and that was definitely my Achilles heel. Sort of growing up, I wasn't bothered at the time, sort of growing up in middle of country, in Banbridge. It wasn't an issue at all, but obviously getting into secondary school, I had a pretty poor view of myself, and I suppose you'd say I was super aware of other people and of myself. I was super aware of a continual little voice that was just like, look, my boy's got no hair. But to the point where, so I suppose I was always able to tell whether people were talking about me from a distance, because people aren't that subtle, I suppose, as well. Even to the point where I was in Saudi Arabia a few years ago on business, and I don't necessarily plan to return to Saudi Arabia, but I was in this mall walking along, and there were 2 women completely in the full burqa with just, I was just able to see their eyes, and I could still tell from just being able to see their eyes that one was saying to the other, look at the size of that fella, just it really tickled me that I could tell that just from, even though there was no language between us, and I could only see, that part, but that visual alertness that was my nemesis is my superpower now. And it's taken me a long time to realize that and to get to that point. And it's still one of my demons, which is why I'm talking about it, because every time you talk about your demons, they get slightly smaller. I have realized. But I find that very encouraging that actually there's a thing that makes me different that I'm now channeling into this crazy journey of creating stuff. And that leads me on to this, because I was telling Catherine, I've gone on a new journey recently, because the Ada College, who I've sort of known, they're if you don't know the Ada College, they're the National Computing College in the UK. They started about 5 years ago. They're named after Ada Lovelace. They have the intention of having a 50-50 male-female split in terms of their students. They are trying to create a diverse group of students as well, in terms of where they take their students from. And they run sort of sixth form and apprenticeships in London. And they're just about to open a new campus in Manchester. And anyway, they got in touch with me one day. I made the mistake of telling one of their sort of deputy head that I needed a little bit more people time, because I've realized that if I'm in my shed creating stuff for people 5 days a week, I go a little bit loopy, right? And so a little bit more people time would be good for me. And next morning I got an email saying, we're a lecturer short for this module. Would you be interested in doing it? And do you know what? I thought, I've got nothing to lose here. I wonder what that's about. You know what I mean? Because I've never been a teacher before. I've never taught, right? And so before I could think too much about it, which is important, I said yes to something that was quite far out of my comfort zone. Which is a rule in life that I have, is that an opportunity presents itself that's out of your comfort zone. You take it and you worry about how to get there later, right? I know that Catherine was agreeing with me whenever we were talking about this at lunchtime. But I started to think, well, what, could I use my visual thinkery methods with these students? In fact, I knew nothing about these students. Anyway, I found out that they were they're sort of second-year apprentices. Turned out that my wife laughs. My wife's a primary school teacher, and I described here that these are sort of 20 plus in age. You know, I've got about 10 students in a class. She's like, that's not teaching. It's not teaching unless you've got 30 people and at least half of them don't want to be there. You know. Anyway, I had 10 people who did want to be there, but the trouble is that the module I had was software quality assurance. Oh my goodness! Like that is that's the worst thing I could. I just didn't think about it at the time, but I suddenly thought, hold on a minute, I haven't done quality assurance since university, and I wasn't even paying attention then. You know, so. And then I thought, well, actually, hold on a minute. The companies I've started and that I've been involved in have all had a degree of quality assurance. So I've got some stories up my sleeve here, and actually, they already knew. In fact, they know more than I do. And whenever the materials were already presented, and so they're like, here's the materials. The materials were like 20 years old, and I'm like, things have changed in the world of software in the last 20 years. Anyway, this was sort of setting up sort of a perfect scenario, because I realized that my challenge was, how can I put together the knowledge that's already there, right? And how can I use a visual approach to do that? I actually even started off with creating a visual map of the students that I had. A great little trick I learned from a person who used to work for Mozilla is get people to introduce themselves. You know, who are you? Where are you from? And say the line, if you really knew me, you would know that, ... And we sort of went around. I sort of started out. I said, well, actually, I used to live in Tanzania, and so I've got a little bit of street Swahili that I can get out and tell you the odd Swahili proverb if you're interested. You know, and then you sort of go around. But I'm drawing out not drawing little sort of visual impressions of people, because people get a bit touchy if you draw a moustache and the moustache isn't there. You know. But just drawing out the sort of here's where people are sitting, here's their name, and then here's the thing they say about themselves. And obviously people like talking about themselves, but you've already made a connection between a person, where they work, and the thing that makes them them, right? So I could I'm rubbish with names, but I could remember all of them because we went through that little process. Anyway, so even from that little visual approach where I had a little map of who they were and what made them, a little individual characteristic. But also the fact that we realized that, here's us talking about bug trackers. And I would sort of start off with, and in fact, I'm using one of these, totally lo-fi. This is my best piece of kit. Although terrible if you want to take it through airport security, because it immediately is like, what's this? You know what I mean? It just looks, it's heavy. You know what I mean? It's got a camera attached to it. What are you gonna? And I'm like, it's a document camera. Anyway, but seriously, it is my best piece of kit because you can plug it into a big screen like this, and you can play the magic game, right? You can say, so here, what do we know about bug trackers? And somebody will say something, and their words will just appear on the big screen, right? And I'm sure some of you are already doing this in your teaching. I'm sure you are. Anyway, but of course, this looks maybe like a bit of a mind map. It looks like maybe a bad mind map, but it's not a mind map because it's collaborative. So there's more than one mind, right? And it's an explorative landscape, I would say, of knowledge that they already have. But not only that, is that because this is happening peer-to-peer, they're hearing their own words getting recognized and they're learning from each other. And I was blown away by that because as in they'll take more from each other than they will from me, right? But they're also realizing that actually bug trackers in Google are different than bug trackers in Deloitte, are different in, and they're actually realizing, we're giving this knowledge that I already have a name, you know, and actually putting it together and organising it and joining it together, which is what this process is about. So, and I found that I can sit on top of that. I can gather up all their knowledge and then spot where some of the gaps are, and start to fill in some of those gaps. And that I don't need to feel daunted to the fact that they know more than me and that their knowledge is more current than mine, because they're working for these companies. But I found that really empowered them and their voices, and that they started to then experiment with the things that came out of their mouths. Let's see. Here's another one. I've now done 3 different modules, and the last one was to do with data visualization. And the assessment was, you know, how do you create to create a poster using whatever data they had, data set that they had found and they'd brought to life. And of course, suddenly we're into storytelling, and I'm like, right, what do you know about storytelling? And this is all them, but they're, you know, we're getting into, well, a good story has a hook. Oh right, how's it? Oh right, brilliant. You know, and talked about what a story arc is. Somebody brought that up, and again, the knowledge was there. The knowledge was already there. It was just in bits and pieces, and it was just about sort of putting it together and recognizing it. Or, look, half the battle is creating a safe space for this to happen, right? You know, where people actually can be open about getting something wrong and whatever else. But that's my main point here, because if you allow me to step into a bit of, excuse me. Bit of Paulo Freire. Again, my wife did one of these sort of PGCE on the hoof experiences where, you know, from day one you're in the classroom, and anyway, I was just peering over her shoulder whenever she was doing the university parts, and she was like, oh, Paulo Freire, you'd really like Paulo Freire, Brian. And sure enough, I found myself really connecting, and obviously Catherine then put me onto a book, We Make This Road by Walking, which is a fantastic, absolutely fantastic book, which again I really enjoyed. But it asks these questions of sort of who defines knowledge and who gives it a value. And again, back to what I said right at the start of sharing or having a shared Irish history. I did some work for Dublin City University recently, and the guy I was working with, a guy called Eamon Costello, we were comparing notes on our school history, our school Irish history. And he was saying, oh, for goodness sake, you know, by the time you got to sort of third year at school, Irish history's so bleak that we were all just done with it, you know. And I was like, I didn't get that version of Irish history. I got the British version of Irish history. And as you know, the British always win, you know, for starters. But I remember us doing, like, there's this little slot of us doing the how Ireland became separated, essentially. It was like in third year, you know, maybe just one semester, and suddenly we're like, history was, hold on a minute, this is relevant to me. And we're talking about the IRA and the IRB, and I was like, oh, is that the B team? You know, is that, well, how did that? We just didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about where this came from, and seriously, we didn't even touch on the potato famine. And how can that be? How can it be that you know, so much is missing, you know, from that narrow British education, and yet the fact that I'm an Irishman, you know what I mean? How can it be? So who defines knowledge is a question we must ask, and we must ask it in technology too. Who defines what is valuable to spend time on and what is not valuable? But also this idea of, again, has been thought a lot before I ever came to it, but you know, teachers and students need to see themselves simultaneously as both teachers and students. I can't tell you how much I learned from those apprentices. And it was a pleasure, and it wasn't a problem. I'd also got nothing to lose, I know, you know, but I got to sit alongside them, and we got to explore together. And that was fantastic, and recognise the knowledge that they brought into the room. And I would suggest that get any crowd of people in a room, and they already bring a whole ton of knowledge into the room. So monologue starts to be a curious thing to do, even though I'm monologuing at you right now. And like in that last vein, Freire also said, you know, that monologue oppresses, but dialogue liberates. And I believe this to be true. So, have I really taken that amount of time? That is outrageous. Have you got 5 more minutes? Have we got 5? That's all 5 more. Right, okay. 5 more minutes. Because I thought what we could do is actually, let's see, where are we now? I thought what I'd do, creating a landscape like that, and having so much knowledge in the room, you get a lot of hocus pocus when it comes to people talking about technology that's coming, and you know, things that we should be thinking and worried about. But I wondered if I posed the question to this audience, to you, whether I could add some words to this graphic. Well, what do you consider should be on our evolving learning landscape? What things can I write on here? Who can give me one? Starter for 10. Well, people. Who else? Global. Sorry? Global. Mm.
Just looking at that and thinking, what's coming over the hill?
Yeah. Yeah. Community. Conversations.
Can we have a volcano in the far distance?
Yep.
Fake news coming out.
Profit. P-R-O-I-T.
We could have both. Love. Reflection.
Sorry? Opportunities. Connections. Risk taking. Epics. Ethics. Not sure how to draw ethics, so I'm just going to write it down. That's okay.
Continuity and change.
Continuity and change. Let's see.
Can I compliment the volcano with a big glacier coming in from the left of government regulations?
Look, there's a glacier right there.
My tower was.
A certain lube about you.
No, miserable.
Motivation.
Mm. Hope.
Risk-taking trust. With the risk-taking trust each other.
Yeah.
Hang glider of empowerment.
Hang glider of empowerment. So as I was saying, there's a few loud voices in the room. You know. I'm going to write empowerment though.
I'll probably post it. Yeah.
We could turn the word into a hang glider.
Peaks and troughs.
Peaks. Yeah. Oh no, how do you spell surveillance? Surveillance.
Big brother.
Yeah, that's much better, like. What about climate? That's got to be on everybody's agenda.
Can we have a big bog at the bottom of data?
Right, I'm gonna stop it there. Obviously, you get a different bunch of people. You're gonna have a different contribution or a different product there. But it's just the idea that most of those things I've drawn before at some point, but they're not very hard to draw. But somehow, if I had have tried to have told you, well, here's what I think you should be thinking about, it wouldn't mean half of what you've just put up there together. And there's something about collaborating with our knowledge that I think we all need to remember. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Let me just skip back to this last slide and just remind you that you must notice things and wonder and hopefully create. Okay, thank you.
What do you say after that? Is there anybody that would like to make a comment or observation or ask Brian anything at this stage? I know we're kind of time poor, but I don't think I could possibly go without giving somebody an opportunity. John.
Is visual communication that you've kind of shown us today a literacy we should be teaching?
Brian, can you repeat the question for any live stream?
Yes, I can. So the question was, is visual literacy something we should be teaching? I think it has been taught in the past, hasn't it? In terms of, yeah, and I think we're going backwards in terms of how we treat visual literacy in terms of the presence of art in our schools. Like I can't. I have 3 kids. I'm always sort of saying to them, look, drawing, the ability to draw, to be able to communicate visually, that goes with anything. It doesn't matter whether you're a botanist or even a street sweeper, you know what I mean, and be able to do a bit of graffiti on the side, you know what I mean. I think that could work. But I think it goes with anything, being able to communicate an idea visually. So why shouldn't it? But I think it becomes tricky whenever, certainly in the UK, whenever it's all about what you can measure. And that's the road to ruin as far as I'm concerned, I think. So I would say yes. So I think we should if we can, but it has been before, and we're squeezing it out, I think. Well, we did get to regression testing. I'll have you know. Yeah. But thanks for that build there. You know. Yeah. Heckling. Eh? Goodness me.
But I do think it shows exactly what Brian said on the last slide, which is if that came from a group of people talking on what they knew, then that obviously was something they didn't know, John, and that you had to deal with subsequently. In the same way, the slide that we produced there had a range of different things, but anybody else coming in could put up a totally different slide. And surely that's the wealth and the beauty of the individual and individual ideas coming together. And I have to say, I've just enjoyed the whole thing. It's made me think about various things. I've written stuff down I want to follow up on. And I think it would just, I'd like to see us all give another big round of applause to Brian. And hope you'll come visit us again. Thank you. At this stage, it's been a long day. I want to thank everybody who came to us today, despite weather warnings and all sorts of other warnings that might have been going on over the last week. Thank you to all our presenters, without whom there would actually be no conference and no Teach Meet last night. In a very, very special way, I want to say an enormous thank you to the team, very capably led by Katie, who for the second year here in AIT has done an absolutely splendid work. Very ably assisted by Pat Seaver up the back there and Richard here at the front. Just one thing that I want to draw your attention to going forward for CESI. We're developing communities of practice around the country. We've had funding for 2 years where Richard crisscrossed the country and had various meetings. He had 57 meetings over 2 years in 14 of the 21 education centres around the country, which is some statistic. There are also a number of workshops held, and we've produced a booklet to help anybody who would like to run a session. Our next big task is that in the coming months, we will, through, I suspect, the list, be looking for people in locations around the country who might run just 1 or 2 sessions in their local education centre. And in this way, I think it'll be a slow build, but it's the concept of taking that community, the network, the peer-to-peer support, encouragement, out of just the conference and the Teach Meet, and trying to make it part of the fabric of what teachers do around the country, no matter where you're located, so that location shouldn't preclude involvement. And to that end, our education centres are involved in discussions and various things that may have been a barrier in the past, such as maybe having to have 10 people at a meeting before it could go ahead. That's all in negotiation at the moment. So the information will come out through the CESI list. I think we're looking at a very, very exciting time. It's about what we all consider that wider area of, as was said, computers in education in all the various guises that means. And as it has become expanded, as technology has become more and more part of society's daily life. So watch out for it, and I hope that you and others within the CESI community, and indeed beyond, will find the space in your life, very, very busy lives, to perhaps run 1 or 2 sessions. Oh, sorry, my hand's on that. Apologies. Wow. So at this point in time, thank you very, very much again for coming. I thank AIT. Can we give a hand to our gentleman at the back, to Cormac, for the live streaming, for those who would have wished that they could be here and couldn't be here. I wish you all a very, very safe journey home. Take your time. If that wind is still out, please take your time. And for the coming year, I wish you all the very, very best. Thank you very much.